GPB, winner of 11 Emmy Awards, including Station Excellence. Thank you for your support.
The 2012 Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series, brought to you from Georgia Public Broadcasting, the Republican race for the 11th Congressional District.
Good evening. I'm Josephine Bennett, Macon Bureau Chief for GPB Radio. We'd like to welcome our viewers, our listeners on GPB Radio, and our live studio audience to the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series, originating from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting. This is the debate between the Republican candidates in Georgia's 11th Congressional District, which includes all of Bartow and Cherokee counties and parts of Cobb and Fulton counties. Some of the largest cities are Canton, Cartersville, Kennesaw, and Marietta. Now let's meet the candidates. They are, in alphabetical order, Phil Gingrey serves in the U.S. House of Representatives on behalf of the 11th Congressional District of Georgia. He has lived in Marietta for 26 years, where he owns and operates a pro-life OB/GYN practice. William Llop has been a self-employed CPA for more than 30 years. He has offices located in Sandy Springs and Macon. Michael Opitz has lived in Cobb County for 32 years. He is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, having served as a special agent in the Office of Special Investigations. Here is the format for today's debate. In the first round, each candidate will answer a question from one of our panelists. In the second round, the candidates will ask a question of their opponent. Each candidate will have time for rebuttal in this round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidates. Finally, each candidate will have 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Before we get started, let's meet our three panelists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Jim Burris, a reporter and the host of Weekend Edition for WABE Radio in Atlanta. Next, we have John Gillooly, a city and state government reporter for the Marietta Daily Journal. And our final panelist is Nanette Sosa. She is an award-winning reporter for All News 106.7 Radio in Atlanta. Now let's get started with the debate. In the first round, each candidate will be asked a question by one of our panelists. The candidates have 60 seconds to answer. As moderator, I will determine if a rebuttal is necessary. By random selection, Michael Opitz gets the first question from Jim Burris.
Mr. Opitz, one of your key platforms involves repealing the Federal Affordable Care Act. You say you'll work toward a return of power and health care decisions to the states and individuals. I have two parts to this question. One, what role should the state of Georgia play in health care decisions that the federal government shouldn't? And two, do you agree with Congressman Gingrey's alternative to the Affordable Care Act?
The health insurance and health services are very important to all of us. It's important for us to remember how health insurance got started during World War II when companies offered health insurance as an inducement to go to work for that company. And since that time, it has grown larger and larger and has become important, so important to all of us that without it, we see that there are problems and there are issues. The role of the federal government for health care is not defined in the Constitution. This is more of an issue for the states. And we need to return health care to the individual and make sure that it is affordable for the individual. For instance, corporations are able to deduct the cost of health insurance premiums, but individuals are not. So we need more than just tax deductions. We need tax credits.
Michael Opitz, I'm sorry, that's all the time we have.
Okay.
John Gillooly, it's your turn to ask Phil Gingrey a question.
Good afternoon, Congressman. Senators Isaacson, Chambliss, Congressman Scott, your two opponents up there, Mr. Opitz and Mr. Llop, have all declared how they're going to vote on the $8.5 billion with a B tax increase known as T-Splost on Tuesday. Yet last month you told me you were still undecided, and last week your press secretary kind of dodged the question when I asked her. So here's my question. Don't you believe that voters in your district have a right to know where you stand on what Chip Rogers calls the greatest tax increase in Georgia history?
John, I've had the opportunity to vote. I voted early, in fact, last Monday. I'm no longer undecided on that issue. I have voted on it. But I have felt all along that since the Georgia General Assembly, when they passed the TIA, Transportation Enhancement Act legislation, and submitted it to the people all across the state, 12 different districts, as you know. The Atlanta district included 10 counties. 3 of those are part of the Atlanta district, and gave individuals the opportunity to vote. I would say democracy of the highest order. And for me to interfere with that process when knowing that this was a very divided issue and the individuals on both sides feel very, very strongly, either pro or con, that it would have been inappropriate indeed for me to weigh in on that to try to influence their decision.
And our final question in this round is Nanette Sosa's question for William Llop.
Hi, Mr. Llop. While streamlining tax codes and stimulating the economy is important, and I'm sure you know that with the job that you do day in and day out, so is infrastructure. How much should be invested into infrastructure or what should be cut?
Currently, our infrastructure is being handled through the road constructions and somewhat through sales tax and through our property tax. We really need to do more on a local level in getting more funds into that direction. The property taxes, when you're going into rezoning, the owners that are having their properties rezoned should be contributing more into the infrastructure of the roads at that time. When you're doing a massive development, that's where the funds need to come through, more from the private industry as opposed to the complete city 10-county area as proposed in the T-SPLOST. Thank you.
That concludes round 1. It is now time for our candidates to ask a question of one of their opponents. You have 30 seconds for the question, 60 seconds to respond, and 30 seconds for a rebuttal by random selection. Phil Gingrey asks the first question.
It's my understanding that we just ask one question of one of the opponents, not one of each?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I don't have a question for Mr. Opitz, but I would want to ask my opponent, Mr. Llop, if he is a legitimate Republican candidate in this primary, indeed, obviously, he's standing up here with the 3 of us, explain to the constituents in our district why in 2004, Mr. Llop, you not only made a contribution to John Edwards, but you also voted in the Democratic presidential primary.
When you have a choice in government, which is a choice that we have today in 2012, these decisions need to be made each and every day. One of the problems with the Georgia politics is you can only vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. In 2004, I thought the Republican primary would have been better served to have that candidate represented by the Democrats against George Bush. I hope
Rebuttal?
that helps you.
I have no rebuttal.
William Llop, you may now ask a question of one of your opponents.
Dr. Gingrey, assuming the current House of Representatives is reelected, how will you bring fresh ideas to the district? How will you streamline the inefficient tax code? How will you implement term limits? How will you increase the country's educational standings? How will anything change?
Well, of course, there were a number of questions there, Mr. Llop, but in regard to term limits, that's a wonderful thing our founding fathers took care of in regard to the House of Representatives, the House of the People. We have to stand before the people every 2 years, in fact. We have to run in new districts, and indeed that's what we're doing, running for this position in the 113th Congress. So I think we, the people, thank God and thank our founding fathers, have given the opportunity for term limits at the ballot box. In regard to what needs to be done as we go forward, clearly I stand very strongly behind a balanced budget amendment. 49 out of 50 states have that, including our own great state of Georgia. The Congress of the United States cannot, will not get anywhere close to balancing our budget unless we put those handcuffs of a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, put that into effect, and then we'll finally get this country back on the right track and avoid going down the road of Greece and some of the EU countries.
A rebuttal?
Yes, I believe you do believe that that alone will correct the 10% approval rating in Congress now, but we do have problems, and I personally do not believe that those issues can be resolved in 2 years as they have not been resolved in the last 2 years, where we have incurred under Congressman Gingrey's, Dr. Gingrey's reign, an additional $11 trillion in debt. Thank you.
Do I have an opportunity for a rebuttal?
Actually, I'm sorry, you do not. Okay. And our final question in this round comes from Michael Opitz.
My question is for Mr. Llop. Phil Gingrey, the incumbent, has voted again and again to allow federal agents the right to break into your home and search for whatever they want, even plant a bug without your knowledge, and to make matters worse, you are not allowed to tell anyone that it happened. Not your spouse, not your lawyer, not even a federal judge. This is a constitutional travesty. And you can imprison Americans without a trial. So the government is allowed to issue warrant access to all of our personal phone, email, and communication.
Could you just ask, I'm sorry, need to ask the question.
Would you vote for these bills?
The CISPA, the NDAA, I've heard you speak of those on numerous occasions on this entire campaign. You have yet to come up with a way to resolve the people's issues in the 11th District. I hear of everything that we're doing wrong. The blame game keeps on coming out of Mr. Opitz's mouth. And really what we need solutions. I offer solutions through tax reform. Thank you.
I do have a rebuttal. The Constitution is our guiding document for this country. Without constitutional principles and without our following the Constitution, without our government officials following the Constitution, we have rule of law by man. And that is not who we are in this country. We have constitutional protections. We have a Supreme Court to oversee, to ensure that our protections are withheld, and the Constitution is also upheld. That is probably the most important thing, since that is the founding document of this country.
Okay.
And without that protection, this country is no more.
That concludes our second round of questioning. For those who may be joining our program in progress, this is the debate among the Republican candidates in the primary election for Georgia's 11th Congressional District. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidate of his or her choice. Candidates will be allowed 60 seconds to respond. As moderator, I will determine if an opposing candidate will be given 30 seconds for rebuttal. We begin this round with a question from Jim Burris.
Congressman Gingrey, this question is for you. You favor cross-state selling of health insurance as a way to drive down costs, and Georgia was actually a leader, the first state to pass a law making this possible. But not a single insurance provider took Georgia up on its offer, and in fact, not one single Georgian has saved a penny from this idea. Do you still believe this is a good model?
Jim, I don't think there's any question but that this is a good model. This idea of being required to purchase health insurance only in the state in which you reside. Unfortunately, so many of the states, maybe all of them, but I know my own state of Georgia in regard to health insurance policies have certain mandates. Patient advocacy groups come and demand mandates. Specialty medical groups come and demand certain mandates. And at the end of the day, it's the thing that is driving up health insurance so dramatically in our state that so many people cannot afford that, even though these are well-meaning mandates. So to allow an individual to go online, they don't certainly have to get in their car and drive to Tennessee, but to go online and look and see what's available careful and find out that policy. Now, that company would have to meet all of the mandates within the state of Georgia, whatever Commissioner Hudgens says in regard to what is required in regard to money to back up to make sure that you can honor and pay claims and that you're a sound fiscal company. But I think this is really the only way to lower health care costs and get the best policy to the people that need it.
We need to wrap it up. Our next question comes from John Galooly.
Mr. Opitz, what does it tell you about Dr. Gingrey that he won't tell us how he's going to vote on the T-Splosh?
I think he just told us how he voted on the T-Splosh.
A rebuttal?
Yeah, well, surprise, I'd have to look at the transcript, but I was very careful not to tell how I voted, nor how my wife voted, or my children, or anybody that I know who voted on this rather controversial issue. So if the gentleman is suggesting that I've been untruthful about that, I'll be happy to have him go back over the transcript of my first remark in regard to that question. John, I believe you asked the same question.
And I have a rebuttal to that.
There's no rebuttal on that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Nanette Sosa, it's your turn to ask a question.
Mr. Llop, we have, Georgia's implementing its tax-free holiday. We was first since '09, and it's supposed to help parents get school supplies and kids and gear and so forth. Do you support this? Why or why not?
I think it's a great program whenever you can pass savings on to the homeowner, to the parent. It's very tough economic times right now. I believe the problem with this year's holiday, it was announced late, and it is late, and a lot of the parents have already acquired those goods for their school. Thank you.
Jim Burris?
Mr. Llop, this question is also for you. Cutting the federal budget deficit means making tough decisions on spending, and one of the government's largest expenditures comes in the form of defense projects. In the 11th District, Lockheed Martin has greatly benefited from these contracts. Should cuts to defense be on the table, and is your answer influenced by Lockheed's presence in the 11th District?
Certainly cuts, the sequestration that is taking place now is certainly a problem. These are automatic cuts, and we need to have these cuts take place. These are no surprises. They need to continue. One of the problems we have in government is, as an engineer working in a government position, he makes $124,000 a year working for the government. The like engineer in private industry makes $61,000 a year. These are the problems with government today. We need to bring government in line with the private sector, and that is the main problem we're having. We have the Internal Revenue Service, which audits things. We have the Defense Department, the DCAA, which Defense Contract Audit Agency, which also audits the same process. If we were to merge those processes together, we can then cut back on savings. There's other ways to save.
Time.
We want to try to save them. We want to keep the man, just cut the pay. We want to keep the pension and cut the pay.
Okay.
Thank you.
John Galooly, it's your turn to ask a question.
Congressman, I'd like to ask you about these letters from Michelle Bachmann and our own Coweta County's Lynn Westmoreland and others calling for investigations into possible infiltration of the State Department and other agencies. I know you've read the letters by the Muslim Brotherhood. My question is, do you agree that such an investigation should take place, or do you condemn the request as I believe Senator McCain did by dismissing it as these are just sinister accusations?
John, I think it's a mistake to name names in a situation like that. The concern, obviously, of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration, any other terrorist group, whether we're talking about Libya or what happened in Egypt, or no telling what the final outcome will be in Syria. So I think that Michelle Bachmann, who led that group of a very small number of House members, that sent that letter to the State Department expressing the concerns and calling for an investigation. I have no problem whatsoever in calling for an investigation of our State Department, our Department of Defense, our President, our administration getting too close to folks that would do us harm. But to name names and specifically accuse someone who is in the public sector, employed by the Secretary of State, been involved way back in the Clinton administration in 1996, I think that was a mistake. I have not talked to her or any of the other signatories to the letter, but I would imagine today they would say that nothing wrong with the letter, that maybe we should not have signaled out the individual, certainly not with more evidence to that effect.
Nanette Sosa, it's your turn to ask a question.
Mr. Llop, you said earlier that you could offer solutions through tax reforms. For example?
Yes, certainly. On the individual side, when you invest money in a business, in certain instances, in most instances, you are not allowed to deduct that investment. Through streamlining the tax code, we invest and you can get a deduction. So really, you're being rewarded for investing. Paying taxes takes place over a period of years. I want to recognize the deduction today. Through recognizing the deduction today, we will get businesses to start operating today. There's nothing more than a wealthy individual, that a wealthy individual enjoys more than not paying income taxes. Through streamlining of the tax code, as I have proposed, it reduces the 60,000 page code, and it will allow us to invest in tomorrow. Also, on the corporate end, we're currently #1 in the world paying corporate income tax at 39%. Simply bring the rate down to 25%, and we will see jobs move into the United States from overseas. Thank you.
Jim Burris, it's your turn to ask a question.
Again, for the congressman, 2 years ago, Georgia instituted a wait list for its AIDS drug assistance program, unable to fund the full need. It quickly ballooned to almost 2,000 individuals, but in the past year, especially in the past few months, the state has been able to lessen that list, due in part to the Affordable Care Act that has an insurance pool for these people. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, what would you say to people who would then be back on the list in your district?
Jim, that list again?
The AIDS drug assistance program.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are certain aspects like that are of concern, but as I look at eliminating Obamacare, the so-called Affordable Care Act, which indeed is the Unaffordable Care Act, in my opinion, the CBO score that just came out scored the bill at about $1.6 trillion. Originally, President Obama said it would be less than $1 trillion, $950 billion. A lot of smoke and mirrors were used in that aspect. And clearly, everything that the president promised in regard to the Affordable Care Act has not been delivered. The cost of health insurance in this 2-year period of time since March 23rd, 2010 have actually gone up an average of $2,100 per family. This is something that the president said if you like your health insurance policy, you can keep it.
We're out of time.
And more are having to drop their employers are dropping their coverage. So it was an utter failure, just as his economic plan has been an utter failure.
Okay. Mr. Gillooly, time for one more question.
One more, okay. Well, how about Congressman, as the president in Congress plays what I believe is a game of chicken with the impending fiscal cliff approaching, which, as you know, will automatically slash billions from the Defense Department. What is your prediction of what's going to happen? Will we go over the cliff?
John, I don't think that we're going to enact $600 billion worth additional cuts on the Department of Defense. As you know, the president had already called for about $475 billion worth of cuts over a 10-year period in his budget. So that's more than $1 trillion of cuts. And as, again, you referenced, someone on the panel referenced John McCain earlier, Senator McCain said that essentially is hollowing out our Department of Defense and our military. Our Constitution, I keep it with me all the time, first and foremost to provide for the national defense, and we have to do that. I agree with one of my opponents who said everything ought to be on the table. We ought to look very carefully and with a fine-tooth comb and make sure all waste, fraud, and abuses are eliminated, but not to gut the military.
All right. We have no more time for questions. Each of the Republican candidates for Georgia's 11th Congressional District will now have 30 seconds for a closing statement. William Llop was randomly selected to make the first statement.
Thank you. For nearly 30 years, I have advised and consulted small to medium-sized businesses as well as individuals on how to be fiscally responsible. I completely understand how decisions in Washington affect everyday Americans. I am number 4 of 11 siblings. I have learned at an early age how to be heard, how to negotiate, and how to reach an agreement. So what I bring to the table is experience, fresh ideas, a track record, and the knowledge to make a difference.
Our next closing statement.
I am William Llop,
Our next closing statement comes from Michael Opitz. 30 seconds.
I will apply my 30 years of business experience to help restore jobs for Georgia's 11th district. The incumbent has no such experience, and I have strongly fought for months against T-SPLOST. I've fought for your freedom in the U.S. Air Force, and the incumbent has no military background. I'll continue to fight for your freedom in Congress and oppose bills like those the incumbent voted for when I know they violate your rights. Please visit opitzforcongress.org to find out more information.
Okay.
I thank you for your time and your vote.
Final closing statement from Phil Gingrey.
I want to thank the moderator. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the Atlanta Press Club and Georgia Public Television, my opponents here, and everybody in the audience, but particularly those of you who are watching this debate. I am proud to have represented for the last 10 years conservative Republican principles in this district, but my work is not done. We need to eliminate Obamacare. We need a balanced budget amendment. We need to take all these shackles off small businesses so they can grow the economy and create jobs. I have a proven and conservative record. I ask for your vote on Tuesday.
Okay. That concludes tonight's debate. We'd like to remind voters that the primary elections will be held on Tuesday, July 31st. Our thanks to the candidates, our journalists, and the Atlanta Press Club. Good night.
This is a GPB original production.